Hi, this is Matt McGeer, working on EDL 850, Module 1, Personal Information and 3 Levels of Government Control in Public Education. A little bit about me. I'm married to Lindsay, who also happens to be my best friend. There's a picture of us hiking in Colorado this last summer. I'm also dad to Ben, who's 5, and Adeline, who's 3. And I got a picture of the 3 of us on Ben's first day of kindergarten this August, which was really exciting for all of us. Some hobbies of mine include good coffee and reading, working out, and pretty much anything outdoors, whether it's work or play. I'm a high school science teacher at Remington High School. I teach chemistry, physics, and physical science. We're a high school of about 150 students, and we've undergone a Kansas redesign project over the last several years that's seen us transition from a traditional block schedule to a flex mod schedule, which is really unique and interesting, kind of like a college schedule. We've added some advisory things for our students, and it's a really great place to work. It's been good for me, and I've learned a lot and grown a lot in my time there. I also serve as our athletic director and boys basketball coach. So 3 levels of government control in public education. First, some areas of support. Local support provides for just under 50% of the total budget of a school. That mostly comes from property taxes on homes and businesses, and the school board has the authority to increase or decrease those tax rates. State support comes partly in the area of accountability and oversight. States support schools by setting standards and administering assessments, which are supports. It'd be really difficult for districts to do that on their own. And then the state also provides funding, generally just under 50% of the total public school funds. And finally, federal support. The federal government acts as a sort of emergency response system, filling in the gaps where state or local governments fail to fund education. There's also some compensatory funding that makes up for some of those gaps, like Title I, which has low income funding, Title VI, which is funding for disabled children, or Title VII, some funding for bilingual education. Those are federal civil rights and equal or equality funding areas, and that accounts for roughly 10% of the national total K-12 funding. And that comes from the federal government and federal initiatives. The federal government also promotes and supports continuous research and improvement, which is a huge support on a nationwide scale. It would be extremely difficult for small districts such as ours or even a small state to research and develop on the level that the federal government can. So who's in charge of each of these entities? At the local level, it's the local school board. Now, these are volunteers elected by the district community. And from our district board handbook, it says the board shall have authority to conduct district business and adopt policies the board deems appropriate to perform its constitutional duty to maintain, develop, and operate local public schools. So relatively free reign under the auspice of the law from the state perspective to do as they see fit to operate the public schools. The school board will select a superintendent to serve as the paid district leader or the CEO of the school. Boards hire or approve the hiring of all other district personnel, typically from the recommendation of the superintendent. They set taxation levels and curriculum. They determine a school calendar, construction projects, consolidation. Pretty much any major decision about a local school runs through the school board, and they clearly have the most control over public schools. At the state level, there's the state legislature and the commissioner of education. The governor to some degree, but really it's these two bodies that have the most power, and these are paid positions. The commissioner of education has primary accountability and oversight. They would oversee standards and administering of assessments. And the state legislature passes legislation and approves a budget for schools each year. And that's a pretty major portion of school funding and one that's out of the hands of the local school district. So states have moderate control over public schools. They're right in the middle of the local school boards and the federal government. And then at the federal level, there are a couple different areas. There's the Department of Education, which manages national education initiatives like the Title I, Title VI, Title VII, Title IX that I mentioned earlier. And really, there's two main functions there. The first is to protect civil rights, make sure that there's no discrimination based on age, disability, national origin, etc. And then the second is to serve as a leader in research, development, and improvement. Again, because of the scale of the federal government, they have an advantage there, and they can subsidize research and foster collaboration between states. We've seen that partly within the Common Core standards in the last decade or so. Um, that was at least to some degree an initiative of the Department of Education, along with individual states that came together to promote that. Congress also has a role, and they allocate money. They pass legislation. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, No Child Left Behind, Individuals with Disabilities Act, each of those are from Congress, and they do have money tied to them. Again, that's usually contingent upon some sort of requirement being met, but the funding is such that most schools are going to meet those requirements in order to get the funding. Congress does have minimal power over public schools, as does the United States Department of Education. They really don't wield much power in terms of what a local school district does on a day-to-day basis. So component influence. Component 6.1 there, local school boards have the most influence over component 6.1. Evaluating, developing, implementing management, communication, technology, school level governance, and that's really where I focus there. School level governance goes to local school boards. Those operation systems that support individual students, that support learning needs. Local school boards are going to influence that through hiring practices. They're going to influence that through purchasing, what they purchase, what they spend their money on, and then through those school-specific systems. Again, I work in a fairly small district. Our school-specific systems are very different than USD 259 in Wichita, Kansas. They're very different than New York City, but they're also very different than some of our smaller school neighbors. And a local school board is small and flexible enough to adjust to the needs and values of their student bodies and of their communities. That might mean that there's an FFA program that's really strong in one district that's really not in another district, and maybe they have more of a business focused or a robotics focused program, or maybe they just have more options. But those local school boards are going to do that at the school level. Component 6.2, evaluate, develop, and advocate for data-informed and equitable resourcing plans that support school improvement and student development. Local school boards do shoulder some of this. State government also shoulders a lot of responsibility for this component. They're the ones that are going to have state assessment and student data collection, and that are going to require that and hold schools accountable for that. Because of the scope of a state, because the assessments are the same, they can play a major role in gathering that data, disseminating that data, and then helping schools come up with an equitable resourcing plan. States are also responsible for equitable distribution of resources. Local property taxes are dependent on property values, and so schools that maybe don't have as good a property value are going to struggle to come up with the funds without the aid from the state. So part of that state responsibility is to support an equitable resourcing plan that promotes equity within the schools of a state. Local and federal groups both share in this responsibility, but the lion's share goes to the state. And then component 6.3, reflectively evaluating, communicating about, and implementing laws, rights, policies, and regulations to promote student and adult success and well-being. This one's really tough, and I kind of waffled on which one to place this on, but the federal government bears a lot of responsibility for this component, especially when you focus on the laws, rights, policies, and regulations. That's really where the federal government does its work in education. They implement the laws and distribute funding to ensure that equity, to ensure that the laws, rights, and policies are upheld, whether that's low income, disabilities, bilingual, civil rights. The USDE also gathers data and suggests policy changes that promote school and student success. Now, it's certainly up to local schools and up to states to implement those effectively, but with the funding that is tied to that, I would say that the federal government is the one that bears the most responsibility for this issue. So how does this all contribute to student and adult success and well-being? The shared responsibility here is the strength, and that's definitely a foundational piece of the United States governing system, but there's multiple sources of funding and resources. That helps if you get a group that is strapped for cash, whether that's a local school board or a state that has cut education budgets. There's multiple sources of funding, and so multiple places where that funding can come from. It's not entirely dependent on one source of funding. This allows for flexibility for districts, which again, when you look back at the 10th Amendment, that's not a United States issue to ensure that every student is educated. So there's flexibility for states, there's flexibility for districts to do what's best for their children and their constituents. And then the size and scope of state and national standards, assessments, and research, this allows for local control while also having the benefits that come from a state standardized test or a state standardized set of standards, or even a nationally standardized test or national research. There's benefits to both the local flexibility and the large scale research. And so this contributes to student and adult success by taking into account both of those strengths and trying to marry them in a way that works for students. My standard correlation is here. In order to work in and improve systems of school building or district, practitioners must first know and understand the laws that govern them. This module was a helpful introduction into the different areas of governance and ways that they influence schools. With the knowledge of the multiple sources of funding and support, it's possible to develop and improve data-informed and equitable school resource plans to apply laws, policies, and regulations. Relevance. This module had clear relevance as a future school administrator because it's important to know how the system of education works. There's no single body exclusively responsible for public education, and each area has significant roles and responsibilities. As an administrator leading a building, it will be significant for me to know what group we are accountable to in each area of school performance. Equally significant is the ability to seek help from the right resource and level of government for questions or issues that may arise in a school or district. And finally, a reflection. This was a helpful reminder for me of some of the relationships between the different levels of government and school districts. My focus tends to go to state funding when I think of government involvement in education, but there are so many other ways that each layer of government supports schools, both financially and through research and development. The funding percentages were also somewhat surprising to me, probably just because of the amount of attention and coverage that state funding receives, and I'll move forward more mindful of the shared responsibilities of the different levels of government in funding and supporting our education systems. And my citations.